In the spring of 1915, the Russian Imperial Army was not simply losing ground. It was beginning to collapse from within. Starved of ammunition, stripped of leadership, and stretched across a front line so vast that reinforcements arrived days too late to matter. And one man, a Prussian cavalry officer who had spent most of his career on horseback rather than behind artillery batteries, appeared to understand something about the Russian military machine that even his own high command had not yet fully grasped. His name was August von Mackensen. And in the span of roughly 6 months, the forces under his command would inflict what many military historians have come to regard as one of the most devastating sequential blows ever delivered against a single nation's army in a single campaign season. What makes this case particularly worth examining is not the scale of the destruction itself. War produces catastrophic numbers with disturbing regularity. What is worth examining is the method. The question of how one commander, working within the rigid structures of imperial German military bureaucracy, managed to bend those structures toward a kind of operational flexibility that the Russian side simply could not match. And what that asymmetry tells us about the nature of military power in the industrial age. August von Mackensen was born in 1849 in Haus, Saxony, into a family of modest means. He was not, by any conventional measure, a product of the Prussian aristocratic military establishment. His family background placed him several rungs below the Junker class that dominated the German officer corps. And yet Mackensen managed to rise through that system in ways that suggest something more than simple professional competence. He appears to have understood instinctively that in a hierarchical institution, the ability to project authority matters as much as the possession of it. His early career unfolded during the Wars of German Unification. He served as a young officer in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. And it was during that conflict that he reportedly came to the attention of Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, the architect of Prussian operational doctrine. Whether this connection shaped Mackensen's subsequent career in ways that can be precisely measured is difficult to establish. What the historical record does suggest is that by the time he reached senior command, Mackensen had internalized something of Moltke's emphasis on mission-oriented tactics. The idea that subordinate commanders should be given clear objectives and then trusted to achieve those objectives through their own initiative rather than waiting for orders from above. This philosophy would prove critical in 1915. But to understand why, it is necessary to understand what the Eastern Front actually looked like in the winter and early spring of that year. The Eastern Front in early 1915 presented a picture that defies easy summary. Unlike the Western Front, where the war had already hardened into the static nightmare of trench systems stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, the Eastern Front retained a degree of geographic fluidity. The distances involved were staggering. The front lines stretched for well over 1,000 miles. Supply lines were primitive. Rail networks on the Russian side were inadequate. And the Russian army, despite its enormous manpower reserves, was suffering from shortages that had begun to produce a kind of institutional paralysis. The so-called shell shortage of 1914 to 1915 is well documented in the historical literature. Though historians continue to debate how much of it reflected genuine industrial incapacity, and how much reflected the catastrophic failures of Russian military procurement bureaucracy. What seems clear is that by early 1915, Russian artillery units were being rationed to a small number of shells per day. Numbers that made sustained defensive fire essentially impossible when facing a determined German assault. The infantry were sometimes sent forward without adequate rifle ammunition. Entire divisions were reportedly ordered to wait for their predecessors to fall before picking up their weapons. Into this environment, the German High Command began to develop what would eventually become the Gorlice-Tarnow Offensive. The planning process itself is worth examining carefully. because it reveals something about the German approach to operational decision-making that distinguished it from Allied practice on both fronts. The concept emerged largely through the efforts of Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of the General Staff, and was refined in close collaboration with the staff of the German 11th Army, which was being assembled specifically for the operation. Mackensen was assigned to command this force. The selection of Mackensen for this role is in itself analytically interesting. He was not the most intellectually prominent of the available German commanders. He was not a theoretician. What he was, by the assessment of those who served under him, was an extraordinarily effective communicator of intent. Someone who could translate complex operational objectives into clear directives that his subordinate commanders could act upon without requiring constant clarification from above. The German 11th Army that Mackensen commanded for the Gorlice-Tarnow Offensive was a formidable instrument. It included some of the best-equipped divisions available on either front. More importantly, it was supported by an artillery concentration that, by the standards of the Eastern Front in 1915, was almost overwhelming. The Germans had assembled roughly 1,500 guns for the initial assault phase. This was not merely a quantitative advantage. It reflected a qualitative understanding of how modern artillery should be used. Not simply to destroy enemy positions, but to suppress, disorient, and paralyze the defending force long enough for infantry to close the distance and complete the breakthrough before the defense could reconstitute itself. The offensive launched on the 2nd of May, 1915. The preparatory bombardment lasted approximately 4 hours. By the standards of the Western Front, this was brief. But on the Eastern Front, where Russian defensive positions were generally shallower and less elaborately constructed, 4 hours of concentrated German fire had effects that took the Russian command entirely by surprise. Yet the initial German infantry assault achieved a breakthrough on the first day, something that was becoming increasingly rare on either front by 1915. What happened in the days and weeks following that initial breakthrough is where the Mackensen operation becomes most analytically revealing. The German doctrine of Durchbruch, breakthrough, was not simply about punching a hole in the enemy line. The harder challenge, and the one that had defeated offensive operations on both fronts repeatedly, was exploitation. The ability to move forces through the breach fast enough to prevent the defender from closing the gap. In most offensive operations of this period, exploitation failed because the attacker's forces were exhausted by the breakthrough fight and could not advance faster than the defender's reserves could be moved by rail. Mackensen and his staff appear to have thought carefully about this problem. The operational approach they adopted emphasized continuous pressure rather than the pause and reorganize rhythm that characterized many contemporary offensives. German forces were rotated forward so that fresh units were always at the tip of the advance. The staff worked to ensure that artillery support kept pace with the infantry rather than falling behind as the front shifted. And critically, Mackensen exercised the kind of decentralized command that allowed local commanders to exploit opportunities without waiting for approval from higher authority. The Russian response to the Gorlice-Tarnow breakthrough revealed the structural weaknesses that would ultimately produce the scale of losses historians continue to debate. The Russian Third Army, which bore the brunt of the initial assault, had neither the artillery reserves nor the communication infrastructure to organize an effective counterattack. Its commander, General Radko Dmitriev, sent repeated urgent messages to the Southwestern Front headquarters requesting reinforcements and permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. The responses he received were delayed, contradictory, and ultimately inadequate. The Russian command system, organized around a culture of deference to authority that made rapid adaptation almost impossible, could not match the tempo of the German advance. By mid-May, the Russian Third Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The number of prisoners taken in the initial phase of the offensive was measured in the tens of thousands. Dead and wounded added further to the toll. But the deeper significance of what was happening was not captured in any single engagement. It was visible in the cumulative effect of continuous pressure on an army that lacked the institutional capacity to reset and reconstitute its defenses. The offensive did not stop at Gorlice-Tarnow. Mackensen's forces continued to drive northeast, taking Prussian in June, a fortress city that had changed hands twice already, and then pushing on toward Brest-Litovsk. The campaign evolved into what historians have come to call the Great Retreat of 1915, in which the entire Russian position in the region of Russian Poland became untenable. By September of 1915, the Russian army had lost not only enormous quantities of territory, but also the capacity to mount coherent offensive operations for the foreseeable future. The total number of Russian casualties across the 1915 Eastern Front campaign season is a figure that historians approach with considerable caution, because the Russian records from this period are incomplete and inconsistent. Estimates of prisoners taken by the Central Powers alone in 1915 routinely exceed 300,000 for the period most directly associated with Mackensen's operations. When killed and wounded are added, figures approaching or exceeding 400,000 for the relevant operational period become plausible, though they remain contested. What is not seriously contested is that the scale of destruction inflicted on the Russian army in 1915 was severe enough to produce fundamental changes in how the Russian state managed both its military leadership and its war economy. What this campaign reveals about August von Mackensen himself is not easily reduced to a simple verdict. He was not a military genius in the mold of commanders who transformed the intellectual foundations of warfare. His operational approach was, in many respects, a disciplined application of existing German doctrine rather than a radical departure from it. What he brought to the execution of that doctrine was something harder to teach and harder to measure. A quality of command presence that sustained the operational tempo of a complex, a multi-army offensive over a period of months without the kind of coordination failures that derailed comparable operations. It is also worth noting what Mackensen's success in 1915 did not resolve. The Russian army was damaged severely, but not destroyed. It retained the capacity to reconstitute itself, which it demonstrated in the Brusilov Offensive of 1916, one of the most successful Allied offensive operations of the entire war. The structural problems that Mackensen exploited so effectively in 1915 were real, but they were not permanent features of the Russian military system. What the Germans achieved was a devastating but ultimately temporary disruption of Russian fighting power. Mackensen's career after the Eastern Front offers additional evidence about the nature of his command abilities. He went on to lead the campaign against Serbia in the autumn of 1915, and then commanded the forces that overran Romania in 1916. Two additional operations that demonstrated his capacity to manage coalition forces and operate across complex terrain. He was promoted to Field Marshal in June 1916. Making him one of a small group of commanders on any side to hold that rank during the war. What the historical record as a whole seems to suggest is that August von Mackensen represents a specific and relatively rare type of military leader. Someone whose value lay not in conceptual innovation, but in operational execution. The German military system of 1914 to 1918 produced several such commanders, and it is arguable that this capacity for high-quality execution was itself a form of strategic advantage, independent of any particular tactical or technological edge. The 6 months in which Mackensen's forces destroyed, captured, or drove back what historians estimate at somewhere around 400,000 Russian soldiers did not end the war in the East, but they altered its character profoundly. After 1915, the Eastern Front became a different kind of conflict, one in which both sides had been forced to confront the limits of what industrial-age armies could actually accomplish against determined opponents with continental strategic depth. Mackensen's campaign was, in this sense, both a demonstration of what the German military machine could achieve at its best and a preview of the strategic impasse that would eventually consume every major power involved in the war. The question of how one man's command philosophy shaped the outcome of an operation that affected millions of lives is, ultimately, a question that resists clean answers. But it is a question worth asking carefully. Because the answers reveal something not just about August von Mackensen, but about how military institutions succeed and fail under the pressures of modern industrial warfare. What the 1915 Eastern Front campaign ultimately illustrates is something that military historians have returned to repeatedly without arriving at a consensus. That decisive battlefield success does not translate automatically into strategic resolution. Mackensen delivered exactly what the German High Command asked of him. The Russian army absorbed losses that would have ended any smaller nation's participation in the war. And yet 2 years later, it was not German military superiority that removed Russia from the conflict. It was internal political collapse. The gap between operational success and strategic outcome is one of the defining puzzles of this war. And Mackensen's campaign sits at the center of it. If this kind of deep operational analysis is something you want more of, then subscribing to this channel is the single most effective thing you can do right now. We do not summarize history. We examine it, the decisions, the failures, the moments where competence collided with circumstance, and the results changed the world. Hit the like button if this kind of analysis is what you came here for. And turn on notifications so that the next time we go this deep into a story that most channels never touch, you are there from the beginning.